Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 672 for the 10th of Tishrei in a regular year. This is the episode for Yom Kippur, so naturally I am pre-recording this episode before Yom Kippur, so hopefully you are listening to this episode before Yom Kippur as well, or if you're catching up, then you're listening to it after Yom Kippur. For those of you that are listening to it before Yom Kippur, I wish you a very easy and meaningful fast. There's a misconception that Yom Kippur is meant to be a sad or solemn or very serious kind of day, when in fact Yom Kippur is meant to be a very happy day. This is the day when we get our slates cleansed. We become like angels. We are renewed. We get atoned for all of our misdeeds, all of the mistakes that we've made over the past year. So when we're fasting, unlike the fast of, for example, Tisha B'Av, which is meant to be a very solemn and sad fast, where we're kind of like doing a lot of like, we're trying to get ourselves into a state of mourning. The fast on Yom Kippur is actually supposed to be a happy kind of fast. It's supposed to be that we're supposed to be tapping into a place of such high pleasure and such high connection with God that we become like angels who don't need food, who don't need physical nourishment in order to sustain ourselves. Like it's the one day of the year that we actually can have the potential to tap into this level of spirituality, of transcendence that allows us to transcend our bodily needs, our bodily functions, which is meant to be a very happy thing. So anyway, so that is just a little thoughts on Yom Kippur. I thought I'd mention that, seeing as this is the episode that corresponds with that date. And now let's get into the Tanya. So pretty recently, I went on a small mini vacation to Myrtle Beach. Myrtle Beach is a very touristy vacation town, if any of you have been there. And I happened to be staying in a place that was really close to an amusement park. So now the really fun thing about amusement parks, amongst the rides and all that stuff, is the lights. It's really bright neon lights. It kind of gives this like party atmosphere. And the fun thing about staying in a place that's near the amusement park, or that's near some kind of fair or something like that, is that even if you're not actually at the amusement park at that time, and even if your windows are closed, and even if the curtains are drawn, very often, if the lights are intense enough, if the party outside is great enough, the light kind of seeps in just a little bit. Hopefully not enough to keep you up at night, but just enough to give you that sense that there is something exciting going on. There's some kind of party outside. And while the curtains might be covering up the light to a certain extent, unless they're really those really thick like blackout curtains, like entirely, usually there's a little bit of light that comes through. And of course this is going to depend on the intensity of the light, and it's also going to depend on the opacity of the curtains. So how does this relate to the Tanya today? Well, today we're actually going to be talking about this idea in a spiritual sense, this idea of a spiritual partition, a spiritual curtain that exists, and a light that actually is so powerful that it bursts through the partition. However, just like a physical curtain, even if the light bursts through the curtain, it's not going to have that same intensity as if the curtain weren't there. So the curtain does kind of serve as this barrier to a certain extent. The same thing is spiritually as well, that the partition serves a very big purpose in the spiritual sense, in the sense of really blocking out the full radiance of the light. But as we'll see, the light does still seep through. The light bursts through the partition is the language that's used, to such an extent that it's the same light, even if it's not necessarily as radiant as it is behind the partition, it's still there. So what is this talk of radiance and light and partitions and all that stuff? What is this talking about? So again, this is going to be one of those a little bit more esoteric episodes today. We're still in the middle of Epistle 20 of Iggeres HaKodesh, which is the entire epistle is quite esoteric, quite Kabbalistic. But again, I'm going to try to make this as comprehensible and relatable as I can, based on this illustration of the partition and all of this. So what we're talking about, what the takeaway message is of today's episode, if you don't get anything else out of today's episode but this one message, it's this: that the light, God's infinite light, God's radiance, is just as much present here in our physical reality, in our everyday life, as it is in the highest of all the spiritual realms. There's an unbroken chain of this light that seeps through all of the worlds, like in this way of almost like a laser beam. Like, so lasers, like, again, that might be a good imagery to think about as well. A laser is known to be so intense that sometimes it can actually even like burn through fabric if the laser is intense enough. And that's kind of the idea here of this beam of light that we're going to be discussing today. This beam of light in Hebrew is referred to as the kav. We've spoken about this already. We brought it up a few times. Kav in Hebrew literally means line. For a full discussion of the kav, it's like that's outside of the scope of this particular podcast. But in brief, the kav is known as like the measuring stick through which God measures out all of creation. So it's sort of like when God originally, he wanted to, I've mentioned this in previous episodes, God wanted to create a world, wanted to create a reality outside of himself. So first he had to make space for that. So he totally removed himself, so to speak, in such a way that his light could not be perceived at all by anything that he would create. And then it's like, okay, now there is this space, this void, this empty void. And then in a very measured way, God brought his light back in an extremely concentrated and constricted way. And this is what's known as the kav. And this is, again, the measuring stick through which God measured out how much of every detail of creation, what every single detail of creation was going to look like. So the kav really contains within it, it's kind of like the essence, the really like concentrated form of all of creation is contained within this kav. And this kav travels through a certain path, as we'll see. And we've learned about the different worlds. So we have like the world, the four basic worlds, the worlds of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. And we spoke about how really creation, in the real sense of having something other than God, really only manifests in the second world, in the world of Bria. Whereas in the first world, the world of Atzilus, it's just emanations. Everything is really nullified to God. So in that world of Atzilus, the kav is totally there, and it's totally shining and radiant in its full glory. It totally manifests godliness in the full sense. But then within that Atzilus, in order for there to be that thing other than God in a real sense, that ex nihilo creation that we've been talking about, God set up a partition through which would stop, which would halt that line, that kav, from moving. And then after that partition, that's when all the other worlds come about. And some people mistakenly think that the partition really obstructed the light entirely, so that now it was just like, okay, up until the partition, it was really just pure godliness, and it was really the essential nature of godliness and this ability to create ex nihilo. And then after that, after the partition, you have all of these different creatures and these different creations, but somehow they're really, really separate from God. And what we'll learn about today is that this is not the case at all. That the only difference in terms of the worlds that are below Atzilus is in terms of the radiance of this kav, in terms of how much they manifest and reveal their inherent godliness. But in terms of their essential nature, the godliness is still there. The ability to create this creative ability, which is epitomized in the creation of ex nihilo, is still there in all of the worlds as it comes down. So today we're going to explore this a little bit. It does get quite technical, so just bear with me. And again, if you don't get all the details, that's okay. Again, the main message of today is just this idea of how godliness, essential godliness, really seeps down into everything and everywhere, into our physical worlds. And that's the basic idea. But today we're going to really, try to unpack it all, like in kind of like mapping it out. Like we're exploring that whole process, just like we would if we were studying, let's say, biology, Lahavdil, or something like that, where we would want to really explore a certain organ or a certain cell or something like that and really get into all the details. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains this. And once again, I will explain this to the best of my ability, but it's so dense. There's just like a lot of really, really dense ideas here that each one, like every sentence could be a whole episode or more on its own. So bear that in mind when you're feeling frustrated. Like I kind of felt frustrated in learning this and thinking about how to give it over, because it is really, really dense, but we'll do the best we can. We'll learn this together. So here we go. So, and again, for context, we are in the middle of Epistle 20 of Iggeres HaKodesh. So the Alter Rebbe begins and he brings up this idea of the zivug, of the union between the Zer Anpin and Nukva of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So just as a quick refresher, we've spoken about this previously, that there's the Zer Anpin is the 6 male, masculine, and emotive attributes. The Nukva is Malchus. And we've spoken about how the union between the Zer Anpin and the Nukva, world of Atzilus, creates the souls and the angels within the world of Bria. So you can go back a few episodes ago where we spoke about that. So now we're talking about, so what happens? So that's when you have this union between the masculine and feminine in the world of Atzilus. What happens if you have this union, this intimacy between the Zer Anpin and the Nukva in the 3 lower worlds, in the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya? This union between these 2 forces causes the creation, something from nothing, of all of the creatures and all of the formations and all of the things that were made in these particular worlds. So in the Hebrew, the wording is very specific. Why does it say the beings, the things that were the formations and the things that were made, is kol hanivraim, hanotzarim, v'hanesim. This is a reference to each one of those worlds. Nivraim is an allusion to the world of Bria, the creation. Notzarim is an allusion to the world of Yetzirah, formations. Nesaim is an allusion to the world of Asiya. So basically, once again, the union between the masculine and feminine forces, the Zer Anpin and the Nukva, within each one of these worlds, is what creates something from nothing, all of the different creatures in each one of these worlds. How does this happen? How does it create something from nothing? How does this process happen? It happens through the light of the neshama that is found within them. Why? Because the light of the neshama is godliness. And this light of the neshama comes from the vessels of the 10 spheres of Malchus of Atzilus. So let's just pause here for a second and explain all of this and what we're talking about, if you're as confused as I am, or as I was when I first read this. So the basic idea, as we've been learning about, if you've been following along this epistle for a while, is we've been really, really talking about and emphasizing the specialness of the uniqueness of ex nihilo, and that ex nihilo creation is something really, really special, and it's really different than causality, that type of creation, like an evolutionary type of creation. And we talked about how this ability, this godly ability, which is unique to God, to create something from nothing, the origin of that ability, the source of that ability, is in Malchus of Atzilus. That's where it all happens. And to be specific, it's specifically within the vessels of the 10 spheres within Malchus of Atzilus, to be really particular. And we said that is alone the only place that has that power to create something from nothing. Everything else we spoke about, yes, different types of creations happen, but they happen in an evolutionary way. The power of ex nihilo, it has to come from those vessels of the 10 spheres of Malchus of Atzilus. We spoke about this more in depth in previous episodes, so you can look that up there. So now the question is, the basic question that's coming up is, if that's the case, that all of ex nihilo creation must come from this level of the 10 spheres of Malchus of Atzilus, how is it possible that now we're saying that these other worlds, not Atzilus anymore, now we're talking about Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, that they too have this ability to create something from nothing, that they create, this creation happens through the union and masculine and feminine forces, also creates these beings within their world. How does that happen? So the Alter Rebbe explains, this happens because of the light of the neshama that's found within each one of these worlds. And the light of the neshama, the light of the soul that's found in each one of these worlds, like each world has different aspects to it. And one of the aspects of each world is its soul. And that soul is godliness, and that soul comes from the vessels of the 10 spheres of Malchus of Atzilus. So to explain this in kind of like a progressive way, is that the way this happens is that within the world of Atzilus, then you have the vessels within the world of Atzilus, and we said that there's actually 30 vessels in total. There's 10 internal vessels, 10 middle vessels, and 10 external vessels. And these 10 external vessels of each world become the neshama, become the soul of the world below it. So here we see that basically the 10 external vessels of Malchus of Atzilus became the neshama of the world of Bria. And so since the neshama of the world of Bria is coming from these 10 vessels, which those 10 vessels have within them the power to create ex nihilo, the neshama also contains within it that vitalizing force, that ability to create something ex nihilo. So that's reason number one. We're going to go through a few reasons as to why it is that these different worlds, the neshama within each one of these different worlds has the ability to create ex nihilo. So that's one. It's because the neshama actually comes from the vessels, from the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus, so which is the source of the creation ex nihilo. Now, reason number two. What's the second reason? So within this Malchus of Atzilus, within these vessels of Malchus of Atzilus, which is where the neshama comes from, we find that there is a radiance of the kav, of the infinite one, the infinite light, the Or Ein Sof. The radiance of this kav is vested within the world of Atzilus up until what's known as the parsa. So the parsa is what's known as the partition. So we spoke about this in the introduction. So within the world of Atzilus, there's the radiance of God. It's totally God emanation and nothing but God. And then there's this partition that separates Atzilus from the other worlds. And up until that point of the parsa, up until the point of the partition, the radiance of this kav shines and is very strong and very manifest there. And by virtue of it being very strong and manifesting there, so what does that mean? It means that this radiance of the kav radiated specifically within the vessels of the 10 spheres of Malchus. So now, again, so back to these 10 spheres of Malchus. So we said already that the 10 spheres of Malchus, they created the neshama of the world below it, right? The world of first Bria and then eventually Yetzirah and Asiya. So since the radiance of the kav was vested within these vessels, then when the vessels broke through the partition, because that's what they needed to do in order to get to those lower worlds, they smuggled along with it this radiance of the kav along with it. And so this caused the fact that this radiance of this kav to shine really within these other worlds, these worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asira, just like it shines within the world of Atzilus itself. So again, so even though, yes, the partition is there, but somehow it broke through the partition by virtue of kind of being smuggled through with the kelim. Just like it's like if you have a partition on a window that is supposed to not have the light let come in. If the light is strong enough, and if you use a laser beam or something like that, then even the light might be able to burst through that partition. So far we have two reasons why that this potential for creation ex nihilo, this creative ability, is found within the worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, and Asira. The first one is that, okay, the creative ability to create these things within these worlds is coming from the neshama of each world, the source of which is the kelim, the vessels of Malchus of Atzilus. And that Malchus of Atzilus is, like we've spoken about, kind of like the hub of where the creation ex nihilo happens. The second reason, which we just mentioned, is because of the kav, because the kav really is the true source of the creation ex nihilo, and that kav is what gets the radiance of that kav gets vested within these vessels, and that kind of gets smuggled through together with the vessels into those lower worlds, giving them the ability then to create ex nihilo. Now we come to a third reason. What's the third reason? Okay, so up until now, we've only been talking about the radiance of the Kav. But what about the Kav itself? So within the world of Atzilus, the Kav doesn't live in the world of Atzilus. The world of Atzilus is still a world, after all. So the world of Atzilus, as great and lofty as it is, it's merely the world of emanation. These are where emanations of God happen. But the Kav itself, like the actual Kav, the actual line, measuring stick through which God created the world, this is vested in something even higher than Atzilus. Where is it vested? It's vested at the end of what's known as the Netzach Hod Yesod, or otherwise known as Nehi, of Adam Kadmon. Again, don't get overwhelmed with all the terminology, but what is Adam Kadmon? Adam Kadmon literally means primordial man, and this is a world, kind of, quote unquote, I'm going to say quote unquote world, that's even above Atzilus. Why is it a quote unquote world? Because it's not usually listed in when we talk about worlds. We talked about how there's the four basic worlds, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, Nesiah, but then there's this thing called Adam Kadmon. What's Adam Kadmon? Primordial man. This is the place of really potential, of like, it's like sort of like before any kind of world. It's like the planning stage, like really even more than planning. It's like really, it's before, it's like the blueprint kind of, I guess you could say, of the worlds, like really that like beginning stage of everything before there were actually any kind of worlds at all. And so that place of Adam Kadmon contains within it everything. It contains within it, it's like sort of like God's plan, God's master plan for all of creation. The higher worlds, the lower worlds, all of those kind of things. And so this Kav is the actual, where is the Kav? Not the radiance of the Kav, but the Kav itself is vested in this place. This is where it's found. It's found in the lower parts of Adam Kadmon. And what is this lower parts of the Adam Kadmon? This is the lower parts of what's known as the feet of the Yosher. What does that mean? Yosher in Hebrew means like straight. So with it, which ends in Malchus of Asiya. Okay, so let's just unpack that for a second. So within Kabbalah, and specifically here we're talking about the world of Adam Kadmon, this like primordial world, there are two aspects of it. There's the aspect of what's known as Igulim, which means circles, and then there's the aspect of Yosher, which is lines, like a straight line. The difference between those two things is that the Igulim, remember we said that the Adam Kadmon is like sort of like the blueprint that kind of like contains the entire purpose of creation. So the Igulim level of that is that it's the purpose of creation in a more general sense. It's like the generalities, like the big picture of the whole thing, kind of like seeing everything all at once. It's like it's related to that level of Soviv Kol Amin, the light of encompassing all the world, so we've brought up a few times, versus the level of Yosher is more specific, it's more direct, it's more particular, and so it's more detail oriented, and it's related more to the immanent light, the level of Mamala Kol Amin. So what we're saying here, basically, when we're talking about this Kav line that's found in Adam Kadmon, and that it seeps down into the feet of the Yosher of this Adam Kadmon, we're saying that this it's like the particularities, like, and then it goes all the way down till Malchus of Asiya, which is the lowest of all worlds, the lowest part of all worlds, which is the world we live in. So we're basically saying in plain English is that in the master plan of all of creation, namely in Adam Kadmon, with all of the particularities and all that stuff, those particularities of Adam Kadmon, they contain within them our world. Our world is part of that master plan in an extremely detailed way, to the point that the Kav itself manifests that. So our world has that Kav, like there's like this unbroken chain through which the Kav seeps down from that level of the primordial man, like of the primordial creation, down into our world. So this is now our third reason why we see that this power of the ex nihilo is found within all of the world. So again, to recap, I'm going to keep reviewing as we go. So number one is because the neshama of each world, which gives it its power to create ex nihilo, comes from the kelim, the vessels of Malchus of Atzilus. The second is because the radiance of the Kav is found within Malchus of Atzilus, and it gets like smuggled through the partition along with the kelim. And then the third one we said here is it's not just the radiance of the Kav, but the Kav itself, which is housed and like it's vested within Adam Kadmon. That Kav itself, like it's that Adam Kadmon, which vests the Kav itself, that Adam Kadmon contains within it all of the worlds, including our worlds and all of their details. And so now, going along with this, so we say, so now speaking about this kav, so this kav is found in its source in Adam Kadmon. That's where it's vested in its real way. But then the radiance of this kav, it radiates out from there and becomes vested in the light of the neshama of the 10 spheros of all of the lower worlds, which is elokus, which is godliness. So it's like, again, going back to the souls of all these worlds, the souls contain within them, not only do they come from the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus, and not only do they have within them the radiance of the kav from the level of Atzilus that gets pushed into them, but they're actually getting this radiance from Adam Kadmon itself, which is even the highest place, the place of this where the kav is resides, kind of where it's vested. Okay, now, so we're talking about basically we've been talking about the kav in different ways. We've been talking about the essential aspect of the kav, and then we've been talking about the radiance of the kav, the ha'ara of the kav in Hebrew. Now we're going to talk about something which is called the ha'ara of the ha'ara, the radiance of the radiance. So what do we mean by this? So let's go back to basics. So let's say here we're talking about the sun. Let's say we're going to give the analogy of the sun. So then the sun is kind of like the initial source of of all radiance, and then the sunlight is that initial radiance that comes out. Now, what's the radiance of the radiance? So one way to think about it is that it's, the sunlight goes into one room and then it kind of seeps into another room. But actually, a better way to think about the radiance of a radiance is in terms of a prism. Because in fact, according to the way it's explained in Chassidus, every time there's a new radiance that comes about from that initial radiance, there's something that changes slightly. There's a shift that happens in some way, which is why we call it kind of like a new level. So if we think about, again, that initial source of all the light as being from the sun, then the initial radiance is the sunlight. Then the radiance of the radiance is when that sunlight hits a prism, and then that prism shoots off new light that is going to be in many different colors, depending on, what angle the prism is at. Now, with this analogy, what's the radiance of the radiance of the radiance? That would be the radiance that happens after this prism light goes off and hits something else. What's that something else? That would be the perception of the viewer, of whoever it is that's seeing this, which is a very subjective thing, right? But that's the beauty of it. That's where our subjectivity comes in. So in fact, the radiance of the radiance of the radiance is actually our subjective experience of reality. That is the multiplicity of the world in which we live in, which is why that in fact is the source of our reality, of everything in this world, is the radiance of the radiance of the radiance. So again, in the analogy of the sun, we have the sun, which is the source of the light, then the sunlight, which is that original radiance. Then we have the sunlight as it hits a prism and shoots off into many different colors, and that's going to be the radiance of the radiance. And then the way that there's a perceiver out there that those colors hit their eye and they perceive these colors coming out of the prism, that's the radiance of the radiance of the radiance. And so that's an analogy to help us understand how this works with God, where God is the source of all the light, there's God's radiance, and then there's God's radiance of the radiance, how it kind of becomes manifest to us here, and then there's the way that we actually experience this radiance, which is the radiance of the radiance of the radiance, which again is the source of everything in the world. It's the multiplicity of the world in which we live in. So this radiance of the radiance of the radiance is found within all of the creatures, all of the formations, and all of the things that are made in all of the world. So basically everything that is made up in all of the different worlds. So we have the different levels here. So we have the radiance that comes down, the radiance of the kav, and that is found within the soul level of the world, the neshama of the world. That's the highest part of the soul. Then we have the radiance of the world, and that's found within the two lower levels of the soul of the world. That's the nefesh and ruach of the world, as well as in the vessels of the world. And then we have the radiance of the radiance of the radiance, and that's found in everything else, and all the beings that are found in each one of the worlds according to their nature, according to what they are. The world of Bria has what are called nivraim, like creations. Then the world of Yetzirah has notzarim, formations. And the world of Asiya has nesaim, those things that are made. And so the basic idea is that there is this chain. It's like it's sort of a diminishment of the light in the sense that it's not a direct light, but it is coming from the same direct source. That's the bottom line of what we've learned so far today. Now the Alter Rebbe brings a citation from Nehemiah, chapter 9, verse 6, where it says, Hayamim v'chol asher behem v'ata mechayed kulam. The seas and all that they contain were made by you, and you give life to them all. So it's like the basic idea, basically, it's to know that it all comes from the same source. Even if it's the difference is in terms of the revelation, the difference is in terms of what is seen, what is shown, but the source is the same. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on to say that and all of this is in the aspect of the extension of the vital force to vivify these things. So meaning to say that this radiance of the radiance of the radiance, which we just described, is the power, the life force that animates all of these different beings within it. Now the Alter Rebbe goes on to say, however, what's the however? So it's like, again, so it's like we've been talking about this whole creation ex nihilo, and that it comes from the kav and the kalim and the radiance of the radiance of the radiance and all of that stuff. So now the Alter Rebbe says, however, okay, all those things aside, the actual essence and being of the light of the infinite one, the Or Ein Sof, does not have any limitation of space at all. So it's like, it's very nice. We're talking about these different radiances and these different vessels and stuff being responsible for creating space and time and all of creation. But when it comes to the actual essence of the light, the essence of like where all of these radiances are coming from, the Or Ein Sof, it is not bound by space at all, but rather it encompasses all the worlds equally. And when we say encompasses all the worlds, so just to understand that, it's in Hebrew, it's Sovev Kol Almin. We mistakenly might think that this is like, we might have an image in our head of this like surrounding light, like a bubble or something like that. That's like circular or something like that. But that's not what encompasses means, at least not in this context. In this context, when we say encompasses all the worlds, what that means is that it's equally there, but in a hidden manner in all the worlds. So we can say the word encompasses or sovev, we can say is hidden, like present but hidden. So this light, this essential light, encompasses all the worlds equally. As it says, and this is from Yirmiyahu chapter 23, verse 24, Ve'et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ani maleh. I fill all the worlds equally, uniformly. So this is God fills everything in an equal measure. And there is no, as it says in Tikkun Zohar, there is no place devoid of God, even in this physical world. So God is equally present in the spiritual worlds, in the physical world, everything, everywhere, all at once, like that recent movie that came out. Just that he is found here in a way of makif and sovev, encompassing, encircling. So again, he's hidden. It's not something that we see, that's revealed. And as this is explained in Likutei Amarim, which we learned previously in chapter 48 of Likutei Amarim, meaning in the first part, meaning in Sefer Shel Beinanim, which we learned about way back when. So, meaning to say that it's that this light, this essential light, is not found there in a way of extension and investment to vivify them and bring them into being something from nothing. So. Right. So it's like, okay, so this is the question. This is where we get to the point in the text where we have the question, where we say that, like, on the one hand, we're saying that God's essential light is present in everything, but in a way that is hidden, in a way that's just encompassing, that he's found in everything in an equal measure. And if it's equal, it's sort of like it's without definition, and thus it's not there. It's not being invested in any particular thing to be able to bring it to life, something from nothing. So how does something from nothing happen? So we spoke about this previously. We said that this happens by way of a ha'ara de ha'ara de ha'ara, a radiance of a radiance of a radiance, etc., which comes from the kav, as we explained above, as we spoke about. Basically, we said that this, like, in-sof light, so we were like saying how it's essentially, it's not it's not revealed. It's found in everything, but in a sovev way, in a way that is concealed. But so how is this? How is it that this Ein Sof light creates things, something from nothing? It's through a ha'ara de ha'ara de ha'ara. It's through a radiance of a radiance of a radiance that comes from the kav. Ultimately, the kav. The kav is really such an essential part of Chassidus. The kav is like really this magical thing. It's like this transmitter of this essential light. It smuggles this essential light into places that it otherwise could not get. So this kav transmits this radiance of a radiance of a radiance. So that's the first way by which this is answer number one to how it is that ex nihilo happens from an essential place in God. It's saying that ex nihilo isn't directly the Or Ein Sof, but rather it's a radiance of a radiance of radiance of the Or Ein Sof that comes through the kav. Okay, now the second point, the second answer that comes up here is that also the other thing to remember is that this light, the Ein Sof light that encompasses and encircles all the worlds, all four worlds of Atzilus, Bria, and Yitzira, and Asiya equally, this light radiates into the inner kav through the kalim of the 10 spheres of Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya. So again, the vessels. So again, we're going back to kind of what we've been discussing before, is that this essential light, even though it essentially is hidden, it essentially is sovev, nevertheless, it does get radiated, and thus its essence does get transmitted in some form, some way, through the inner kav. And when we say inner kav, we mean revealed. So just like outer and sovev and transcendent is concealed, the inner means revealed. So it's revealed in the inner kav through the vessels. So the kav and the vessels really smuggle in this transcendent light through the 10 of Bria, Yitzira, and Asiya, which, going back to what we spoke about previously about this bursting through the partition of Atzilus, the light burst through the partition of Atzilus to enter through these three lower worlds. And through this radiance in the vessels, it gives them the power to create something from nothing. And so basically, just to reiterate that, so we gave two answers as to how it is that creation ex nihilo happens, even though essentially the essential light, which is the source of ex nihilo, is totally transcendent and hidden and everything like that. So it's like, how does ex nihilo happen? It happens in two ways we described. There's two ways this happens. One is through the kav, through the radiance of the radiance of the radiance of the light that comes through the kav. And secondly, because not only does the radiance of the radiance of the radiance of the light get transmitted down through the kav, but the light itself, the essence of the light, actually does come through somewhat in a revealed way. It gets into the kav by way of the kalim, by way of the vessels. So the vessels really have this special power to be able to smuggle this essential light, a somewhat of an aspect of this essential light, into the kav. And through it being revealed in the vessels, this gives them the power to create something from nothing, which is how they are able to create something from nothing, as we've spoken about in previous episodes. And now here, concluding this idea, since the creation comes through the vessels, this is why we see that really the creatures are created in a way of multiplicity and diversity and limitation and finitude, especially when we talk about the letters, which we spoke about above. So the letters are even more finite and even more diverse than the vessel. So basically to reiterate that last point. So basically, the reason why we live in a world that is so diverse and so has so much multiplicity and finitude and all of that is because it comes from the kalim and from the letters, which are by nature all about multiplicity and division and finitude and all that stuff. Like, that's what vessels are. So that's it for today. So once again, I know these things are kind of abstract, and I know that it's like, as much as, it's like I'm trying to explain these ideas and trying to understand them to the best of our ability, they are abstract because we are stuck. And again, it's like we can try to understand these as best as we can. And maybe we can get to the point of like being able to map them out. But at the end of the day, and that's kind of like the point of what we're learning here, we're stuck in our human minds. We're stuck in that ha'ara de ha'ara de ha'ara. We're stuck in the reflection of the reflection of the reflection. So we're learning about the source of this reflection, but we're not seeing the source of the reflection. So it's sort of like we're seeing the rainbow, but we're not seeing the original light that the rainbow comes from. We're just learning about that light that the rainbow comes from, which is something, and that is the kind of the idea of Chabad Chassidus, is to give us this consciousness of the rainbow didn't come in its own from itself. The rainbow is actually an essential light. Again, I know it's like really dense. I know it's a lot, but hopefully, again, it's maybe, if nothing else, piquing your interest to really learn more Chassidus in detail. Also, just the exercise of trying to learn these things, of wrapping your mind around these things, like occupying your thoughts and trying to understand this. I know for me, it's like it's a pretty intense mental exercise to try to figure out, first of all, what is the Tanya trying to say on a simple level, and then trying to figure out how to teach it to you guys, how to explain it to you guys in a way that is comprehensible to me. Like I can't explain something. I would not feel comfortable just kind of like giving over this material unless I really felt like I had a firm grasp on it, at least to some extent. And I don't want to be so bold as to say that I really understand these ideas for real, but they have to at least like somewhat, I have to kind of like have a logical map in my head around them and wrap my head around them. And I find that just doing the exercise, just putting in the work of trying to understand these concepts, that itself is the work. That itself brings you closer to God, because you're using your mind, which is the whole idea of Chabad. Chabad Chassidus is the Chassidus of the mind. It's the Chassidus where we really immerse our minds and meditate upon these ideas. And the more we do that, it really like rewires our minds. It's like that neuroplasticity for the mind, that we're really expanding our brains to contain godly thoughts. And hopefully that will seep into the rest of our being. So that being said, I will conclude here, and we'll continue along these lines tomorrow, where we still have quite a bit to go in this epistle. So stay tuned, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.